I am here today with Lisa Berden and Sonya Delley, and we are presenting for the Commercial Board of Realtors the continuing education for 2023. We have titled our presentation, Maneuvering Commercial Development Financing in Unpredictable Times, which presents both opportunities and challenges. I am a commercial real estate broker. I own Remax Commercial Connection, and I have been in the commercial real estate space for 39 years in a variety of capacities. I started out as a real estate paralegal with some very large practices in Detroit, and eventually moved into the development side under in-house counsel for a developer, and I went into title from there and mortgages, and I am now a broker. So I think we decided to do this as a team effort because we've got I've got two really super experts alongside me who I will let introduce themselves. We also thought it would be fun to do something a little more interactive than what you're used to. So here we go. Sonya.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to all of you in the audience for taking time to learn with us and listen to what we have to say in our various fields of expertise as it relates to real estate development. I myself am a career commercial banker financing real estate developers in the urban environment, largely in the Detroit market. And doing so, I've been privy to utilizing many of the development tools and incentives that we'll probably touch on throughout this next hour to help make real estate development projects come to fruition. There are so many development incentives available, and one came out that I'm going to discuss, a new legislative program, newer than the others from 2010, called CPACE, and I look forward to telling you all about it.
And I am Lisa Berden. I own Linchpin Legal. I have been practicing for about 20 years. I think this year's my 20th anniversary, actually. I started out in the tax world and then moved over into real estate tax-based incentives. So I deal with commercial real estate projects, but in particularly my specialty is complicated capital stacks. So financings that involve a variety of things beyond just bank lending, including programs like CPACE.
So with that said, I'm coming in sort of as an expert representing primarily developers in the city. We are sitting in my office at 6001 Cass Avenue in Detroit, overlooking Midtown. And there are many reasons right now that development is challenging for especially some of the small to mid-sized developers. And I am constantly being challenged, as are they, with the capital stack, which is the way they provide that they get their infusion of cash and grants, sometimes grants. So that has become very apparent especially with the rising cost of construction and the interest rates obviously on the commercial lending side. So I would like to start with talking about entitlements, how they're obtained, and what they can do to help a developer finish a project.
Mm-hmm. So when we were talking before, kind of in prep for this, we talked about entitlements and then incentives, which I think you and I both kind of separate. Mm-hmm. Some people lump them together. So let's start with the definition. So entitlements, from my perspective, are things like zoning and all of the approvals that you need from the municipality and things like that to get a project moving. And then separate from that are the development incentives that you might get that are the financial incentives, right? Mm-hmm. Sonya, is that kind of how you view it as well?
I agree with that. The entitlements are definitely a milestone in your real estate development process. And typically you're going to start working on entitlements, going through planning and review of your project with your renderings, your schematic designs from your architect. Those are the main documents you're going to start with going through planning and review. And then also building and safety, you'll get to that point once all of your construction drawings are done. That's the last stage of your architectural design process. So I'm thinking maybe I should just kind of integrate this PACE funding concept and product that's available. We're touching on the capital stack, and PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, and it's gap funding in your capital stack. So you have your bank funding or your debt fund, you have your owner equity, and oftentimes, especially in this market, your debt funder or your commercial bank is not going to have a very aggressive advance ratio. So they may be, let's just call it 70%, so the math is easy. And PACE equity typically will come in between 10 and 20%, so let's call it 20%. So now we're at 90, and you or your client, in this case, may come to the table with owner equity of 10%. So now, how does this relate to entitlements? Typically with PACE funding, a lot of people think, oh, that's the energy efficient, because remember, PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, is all about energy efficiency. So we actually do not require that you change your design. So if you come to us during the schematic phase of your design development process, that's great. But even if you come in during construction documentation phase, that works too. So I just want to throw that input in about entitlements and timing of seeking all of your funding actually. You can go pursue your bank debt or a debt fund, your equity, you should be building all along, and your PACE funding.
So to kind of step back a second, though, Ellen, when we talked about this, we talked about how do developers like to finance versus how are they actually getting financed, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, they want the easiest way to finance possible, which would be, I'd love to go to a Chase or whatever and get a loan for the entire thing.
90%, SBA maybe, whatever.
Unlikely that that's going to happen for most of the projects that we're dealing with.
Right.
But that is ideally, that's what a developer would like. So when we talk about the entitlements, though, and that whole process, I have a client that started in May of 2022 going through the entitlements process, getting the city to approve. The city happens to, not in Detroit, but it's a city that has a CBA process, so there's community input during that time. Okay, if you're getting some sort of incentive from the city, what do the residents want to see? You may have heard that recently about Detroit and the District Detroit, and one of the CBA processes that they're talking about is actually giving some of those projects.
What exactly does CBA stand for?
Community Benefits Agreement. Sorry.
Okay.
So Community Benefits Agreement is simply, okay, well, if we're giving you a bunch of money, the residents want to know how are we going to benefit from you doing that project, right? So the District Detroit, which is the area around Little Caesars Arena, part of the recent discussions about that has been, okay, well, we want to give the opportunity to minority developers to do some of these projects. That's part of what we want to see in the Community Benefits Agreement. Mm-hmm. A few years ago, if any of you were following the Gordie Howe Bridge and that whole situation, there was a community benefits process that was going on in Southwest Detroit for the residents of that area. What kind of community benefit are you going to provide? So that may be kind of a part of that whole sort of entitlements package, right? If you're doing a planned unit development, that kind of thing, one of the things that you may end up with during that process is environmental and being told what you need to do infill or whatever, what kind of things you have to do for drainage and things like that, because you're going to be developing something that wasn't developed before, all of that kind of stuff. So, Sonya, I have a question for you, though, about PACE, because I think most of the people I talk to say, but they're like, well, we're not doing an energy efficient project, or we're doing ground up construction.
Right.
Can you finance ground up construction with
great
PACE?
Question. Thank you, Lisa. And I'm not even sure if I told you guys that I'm the managing director for Michigan for a direct funder called Pace Equity. And we're based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but as I said before this meeting, we're all champions for Detroit, southeastern Michigan, as well as the entire state. So yes, Pace Equity, founded in 2014, actually pioneered using the CPACE Michigan legislation for new construction. Originally, the legislation was designed to incentivize real estate investors to improve their buildings. If they have an old boiler system, they wanted them to have good, economically feasible financing to upgrade to an efficient HVAC system. The same goes with replacing their roof or replacing their, single pane windows, whatever the case, of moving from regular lights to LED lights. So originally that was the concept, but yes, now we can apply PACE financing to new construction. And I should say this too, the whole notion of energy efficiency with existing buildings and renovations, as the legislation was originally conceived, was replace the old boiler with something more efficient. Okay, clear it's going to be more efficient, right?
Let's hope wasn't built in 1901.
Right. With new construction, what we do is we compare the efficiency against building code.
Okay, so if I'm going to do, let's say I'm doing and I guess this is another question for you, could it apply to a development that is the single family housing development the developer's doing? Because I know we don't do residential PACE in Michigan, but if I'm a commercial developer, but my development product is 100 single family homes, would CPACE be able to finance that?
Well, yes and no. First of all, let's define for the audience. Some of you may or may not know that commercial residential property is 5 units or more. First of all, that's our ground rule. So in Michigan, we can't do any residential development that's less than 5 units or 4 units or less. Now, single family, yes, we can do it if it's all on one parcel ID. So PACE loans go with parcel IDs. Oh. And we can talk about why that is later. But there has to be one parcel ID per loan. Second, is it for sale or rental? Technically, PACE can be utilized for sale product. However, it never happens. It becomes too cumbersome.
Sounds like it would be very cumbersome if you have
right.
that many homes on one parcel.
Right,
ID.
and typically you condo it out when you're doing the for sale and you sell it out. But so for a multifamily though, you could have a 100-unit multifamily apartment building
right.
that you're building from ground up.
Yes.
So then you would look at it and say, okay, well the building code requires that you put in X efficient system. But if you're going to put in X plus 10% or 20% more efficient, then we can finance it because it's more efficient than what the minimum requirement is.
Absolutely. You got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then when can we talk more about PACE right now? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
It's a big component of our discussion today.
So let's talk about the tax ID and like what the mechanism is for the financing. So I'm a developer and I come to you and I say, Sonya, I have this gap of a couple $1 million. Can
Very
you finance me? Right. There's always a couple $1 million a gap. So can you finance me? So how is that going to work for me as a developer? I need the cash today, but I'm going to have to pay you back. How does that work?
So again, in our example of finance, or our example of the capital stack, if a bank is going to do 70%, they're saying, okay, Mr. Miss Developer, go find your 30. Now, if, typically your internal rates of return or just your debt yields, all of that's just not going to work at 30% equity. So you have to source that out somehow. The value proposition for a lot of our developers is just that, the sourcing. So if you bring in other investors, it can get sticky. You have to pay them double-digit returns probably. Yep. You have to worry about them managing you and your project. So it just could get complicated. With PACE, we're in there filling the equity role, but in the form of debt. Now, I think what you're getting to, Lisa, is the mechanism of how PACE works. How is PACE a public-private financing capital source? The public side of it, this is bipartisan. This is private money. And so there's no government money involved in this. So you don't have to worry about PACE not being there every time there's a new administration or if they're working on the budget trying to balance it. The private side is the true mechanism of it, that the protections for PACE funding is the same as the protections for the taxing jurisdiction for the city or county where you're developing your project. So what we do is we place a special assessment on the real estate investor's property tax bill. This is no different than if you live in a condominium development that has an owners association, and you guys have to take care of the streets and the roads, they're not city owned, then they're going to put a special assessment on every condo owner's property tax bill to pay for the new roads.
And if you don't pay that, then they get a lien against your property.
They get a lien. They get a lien against your property. So it works the same way. Now,
But the biggest benefit is how it impacts your primary financing potentially or not.
yes. So the impact is really both from the financing perspective, building the capital stack, as well as the terms of the financing that are only accomplished by the mechanism of the special assessment. With PACE equity, we do not take a mortgage. We do not have personal financial guarantees. We have fully amortizing debt. Our example today is new construction. So with new construction in Michigan, you can go up to 25 years. It's fully amortizing. So unlike your traditional bank debt or subordinated debt, mezz debt, there's no balloon note. So there's no going back to the well, no changing the interest rate in 5 years. No balloon note, non-recourse financially, so no personal guarantees, fully amortizing, and we have a fixed rate that's fixed at time of construction loan. So for 25 years, you know exactly what you will pay. And when do you pay it? Same time you pay your taxes.
So
twice a year, not 12.
Twice.
2 times a year.
So then I get my tax assessment, and it has you're paying for the jails, you're paying for the police, you're paying for blah, 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 and it's going to say you're paying Sonya back. Right?
Well, and if you sell the property within that 25 years, you could require somebody to assume it. I mean,
Well, yeah, because it
you
runs
don't
with the
have to pay
land,
It
right?
runs with the land, so it's fully assumable with no hurdles to jump through.
So what gets
No credit
filed? What gets filed for that special assessment to show up on the
A
rolls?
legal document.
So there's just like a
It's a special assessment
it's just
agreement.
a special assessment agreement, like an easement agreement or
Yep.
something. So
But
that
it's-
would get recorded, and it would say
Yes.
this is when it expires, and then you would essentially discharge it like a mortgage would be discharged
Exactly.
after the 25-year term.
but there is a promissory note.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it's a loan,
Okay, just
right?
yeah.
So there's, but to your point, Ellen, it runs with the land. So if you sell the building in 10 years, somebody else is going to pay the remaining 15 years.
Exactly.
Of
On that
course, 'cause
assessment.
that only makes sense because they're going to get the benefit of that
Right.
assessment
Improvement.
for
Well, the benefit of the improved building
that too.
that's energy efficient with great financing.
And Sonya, I believe that when you did a seminar I went to, maybe this spring, you mentioned that, so we talked about the fact that it's just you've got to have something above building code. But if you build to LEED or to maybe
That
one of the
being
other criteria,
LEED.
yes, which I don't recall right now what LEED stands for.
It-
Energy efficiency, something.
Something
Design.
like that.
Design, yeah. So, but if you build to LEED standards, or maybe there are a couple of other criteria, that you would get a reduction on your points on the mortgage?
Well, thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. So another way that PACE Equity is a leader in the PACE funding industry is that we are the only PACE funder that has designed a special product that incentivizes real estate developers by reducing their interest rate. So this program is called CIRRUS, CIRRUS, CIRRUS Low Carbon. And with the CIRRUS Low Carbon program, we worked with the Building Institute to come up with a set of specifications that would drive carbon emissions down 8% in the building. So if the developer is willing to pursue the carbon low, CIRRUS Low Carbon option and design their building just a little bit more to achieve that 8% reduction, then we give you a reduction in our standard interest rate that's typically in the neighborhood of 60 to 75 basis points.
Wow.
Which is huge in
Yeah.
today's rising interest rate environment.
And that doesn't require that you build to LEED, for example.
Well, actually, CIRRUS Low Carbon, let me put it this way. CIRRUS Low Carbon is in the neighborhood of LEED already.
I guess my question was,
design.
you don't have to get LEED certified because
No,
that's
you do not.
expensive.
Totally
right?
different.
So you could build to
Right.
LEED standards but not go through the
If
certification.
you go to LEED standards, then you're pretty much, if you're thinking energy efficiency in your design, then it's not going, you probably will go CIRRUS Low Carbon without any design changes. But if you're just building to code, then we need to tweak it. And the best part about it, guys, is that we do all the work. We put together a whole
like that.
business
Wow.
case. Yes, we work with your architect, your general contractor. We get your construction drawings, what you're planning on putting in the building, and figure out, in order to meet our specifications for CIRRUS Low Carbon, what has to be done. Once we figure that out, we give you a business case that shows you how much more it's going to cost you. And then we show you what your reward is going to be, how much interest you're going to save we come up with some finite period of time, how much interest you're going to save, energy efficiency, dollar calculated savings, any additional incentives you may be able to achieve by taking this extra step. And it always comes out much, much higher. We've done 6 of these projects so far. I'm about to close another one in a couple of months. And typically, they may spend an additional $20,000. It might be $60,000. Depends on how big the project is. Mm-hmm. But the savings
is like,
it might be $200,000, $400,000. But again, depending on the size of the project. So you're not making this decision in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. We're doing that work for you, showing you the business case. You can make a fully informed choice.
Well, and I will say,
like to proceed.
Representing developers, they're constantly in the weeds on a bunch of stuff. So the fact that somebody else is going to be doing that brain damage for them is a huge benefit in and of itself.
yeah, no, you're not adding any more further effort on their part, and it's conceivably a very good answer to the capital stack
to the thought.
problems.
And I want to say that we're very, very proud. We're doing now. We do our after every closing, we'll do an inquiry, and we're rated 4.5 out of 5. Our customers are rating us that high. So our service is great. We do all of the work. And it brings the capital to the table that can be elusive to find.
So that piece could be the equity piece that a bank would require.
It'll be a portion of it because every lender wants skin in the game from the developer.
So on the other side, and then maybe it's a break time after I ask this question, but so some of the loan documents that I see, there's a specific provision saying you won't get PACE financing. Do you find that you have to go to lenders, and this may not be bank, it may be private equity, but do do you have to sort of do some educating to the lender to say, look, this isn't impacting your rights at all here?
Apparently you do.
Well, obviously banks do not want any other funder to be in front of them in a lien position. Now, I like to use the wording in an unlikely default, in an unlikely event of default. Because no one goes into a deal thinking
they're going to walk
No,
away.
because
Yeah.
assessments and taxes, they take precedence
They take
over
exactly,
any other
as
things.
Ellen is saying, she hit the nail on the head. Just like your family home, you know, if you can't pay the mortgage or your property taxes, then your local taxing jurisdiction is going to say, hey, well, you know, you're a year behind on these taxes. They don't tell you this, but we all know you get 3 years to pay it.
Yep.
If you still don't pay it, so it's kind of patient debt from this perspective. If you don't pay it, well, meanwhile, they're charging additional interest and fees.
Penalties, I assume it goes to the
Yep,
Oakland County
this
or
is-
Wayne County assessor.
That's how government works. It's not just PACE.
IRS gets to slap a lien too if you don't pay your federal taxes.
So they'll place the tax lien on the property, and if you still don't pay it, then it goes up for foreclosure, right? Now, banks don't like that. So, but guess what? There's property taxes in every single real estate deal.
Oh, sure.
Now, just like the property taxes, PACE debt cannot be accelerated. Meaning that unlike your bank debt, in the unlikely event of default, the bank's going to call your whole loan. So if you're borrowing $1 million, you've only, you know, they're going to call $1 million, or whatever's outstanding. With PACE, it's only what's past due.
Ah, so that helps. Yeah.
That helps.
So you
the
can't
bank
do a
swallow.
foreclosure and take your $2 million in my
Right,
example. You
right.
can only pay, you're only entitled to whatever was on the assessments that weren't paid.
Right.
And typically the lender has a right in their loan obligation, in their loan documents to say, look, if developer, you're not paying the taxes, we can step in and pay
We'll
the
pay 'em.
taxes
Yeah.
so that we can
Absolutely.
keep the, and then we're going to charge you, but the bank always has the option to
Absolutely.
make those payments.
And
to,
it makes it's more palatable to them to know that
Right.
it's not.
it's not, you're
This
not going to be able
huge
to
amount
do a
of-
foreclosure
right.
in advance of their rights
Instead
or
of $1
anything
million,
like that.
it might be 50,000.
Right.
And so when you're working on PACE, do you also obviously deal with some tax credits that might help ease the pain of that new assessment?
Yeah, we didn't talk about that yet. Entitlements. I don't know if you were touching on Lisa Brownfield TIF. There's also real estate tax abatements that I know Detroit offers it, and it goes for the state. So I imagine every community can do it if they
Yep.
want to.
Well, what about
Well,
the NEZ?
it depends. So I think maybe we should take a break before we get
Okay.
into that.
That's
Yeah,
another
that's-
subject
Yeah,
matter.
that's okay. And then we could move into the tax incentives because there are a whole lot of them.
There are, and they're growing every day. You're going to want to listen to some tidbits here because I don't know that you need to know every little detail, but it is really important that our clients understand the money that might be available to them in order to help spawn their developments and allow them to continue doing what they do so well, and we get to support them in that effort. So, without further ado, we're going to move into some of the tax incentives that are available, which are numerous, which is why I need to now turn this over to the expert, Lisa.
So yeah, and so just to kind of put some context over this part of the discussion as well, I kind of look at things in a few different buckets. One is the land and the tax abatements surrounding the land, and then alternative financing mechanisms related to that land, then grant programs that might be available, and then my specialty, the federal stuff that might work for your project as well. All of these are dependent on where the land is located, the use for the land, and things like that. So let's start first with tax abatements. We were having this discussion off camera. There are an alphabet soup of tax abatements available for various property, depending on where it's at, what it's going to be used for. So we talked about neighborhood enterprise zone tax abatements. And I will say that many of these programs have a sunset date, so unless they get renewed, they will end at the sunset date, and that, if it keeps getting renewed, varies. So you want to check and see what the sunset date is on each of these. But so neighborhood enterprise zone tends to be for housing. So a developer might get a neighborhood enterprise zone on 20 condo units so that when they go to sell them, the end user has 12 to 15 years of a lower tax rate than they would normally. Each of these tax abatements have to be approved at the local level, and then they have to go to the state tax commission for approval. So it's always a two-step process. Usually, if the municipality that you are in approves that tax abatement, then the state tax commission is likely going to approve it as well. So there's a neighborhood enterprise zone, and then there's the community. Actually, I don't know what CRA stands for.
Well, I wanted to interject for a minute, guys, and jump back. With those NEZs, I want you all to be prepared to mention it to your clients and know that City Council is particularly interested in understanding what is the remedy for parking. So this is all, and you guys know this.
And City Council is getting tougher.
Yeah, parking is critical in Detroit, and secure parking is, they're going to want to know what your remedy is for that. And affordability, are you offering affordability? And then there are some council members that concern themselves with accessibility. So those are things that go along with, planning and designing your project. So keep those in mind, and your client will thank you for sharing that information.
And I will say, having grown up in northern Michigan, I'm going to kind of take the outstate perspective here too and say the city of Detroit is very used to NEZs. They have a lot of experience with approving NEZs. In some smaller municipalities in particular, rural areas, maybe, Rose City or something like that, that's not big at all, you may have to be educating. Maybe not you as the broker, but your developer client may have to do some educating to the city council members on what these various incentives are. So we have the neighborhood enterprise zone. We have the CRA, which in my head is Community Reinvestment Act, but that's a whole different thing that banks have to do. So, but there's CRA, which is also a tax abatement. It's a partial abatement of taxes. And then industrial facilities tax, that is if you are if your client is, let's say, building a manufacturing facility or an Amazon warehouse or something like that, the IFT would probably be what kind of abatement they are looking for. So, but then the sort of holy grail of all tax abatements is the OPRA, the Obsolete Property Rehabilitation Act. And the reason that that's sort of the holy grail is, unlike the rest of these that essentially give you roughly maybe a 50% abatement on your taxes, so you pay around 50% less than what you normally would, the OPRA is a tax freeze. So if your client, let's say they already own a piece of property but it's vacant and they want to build a $200 million manufacturing facility, if they get an OPRA before they build that facility, the tax will be freezed at the vacant tax rate for the term of the OPRA.
Which is
it's gigantic.
and that OPRA is applicable to most buildings in the city or buildings that have like I have a deal I'm trying to work on in Novi. It's an old industrial site, old buildings. They may need to be torn down. They may need to be, some may need to be rehabbed, whatever. But it needs reconfiguration.
Yes.
So I'll give you the terminology, Ellen, on that. With the OPRA, it needs to be blighted or functionally obsolete. So it can't be a nice building that you just your client just needs to trim out, or put in some TI, tenant improvements. No, this needs to be a gut rehab.
Yeah. So let's say, but functionally obsolete in the city is most of the buildings that have not yet been renovated, because you can look at functionally obsolete and say there's no Wi-Fi, there's no, these are buildings that were built in 1920 to upgrade them to current standards. Essentially, the building is functionally obsolete.
Old knob and tube wiring.
Yeah. So you can kind of look, but you do have to show that it's functionally obsolete or blighted, and again, there's a lot of stuff that's blighted. If it's been vacant for 20 years, you got a good argument that it's blighted.
Pretty much.
or environmentally contaminated.
Right.
I think it's
Well,
the third one.
and when you say environmental, so I know that you are an absolute expert in this, and I know that you are a very good source.
Yeah.
But don't the environmental consultants do a lot of these applications?
Absolutely, because I am not an expert when it comes to figuring that out, because you have to have a science background. But what I will tell you is that what you want, if you want it to be environmentally, want it to be, but you can't get functionally obsolete by blighted. You want a kind of dirty property. Like, you don't want anything that's like a Superfund site.
Right.
Because that's a lot of liability.
You could see the oil spots.
Right,
everywhere.
but if you have a phase 2 because there was there might be some asbestos in this building or lead paint, which almost all of the buildings here, because of the time period they were built, are going to have asbestos wrapped pipes, potentially lead-based paint on the interiors, then those might create a brownfield, which would also qualify you.
Right. Right.
So that is another way to qualify.
And is the brownfield tax credit, does it have to be directly utilized to clean the property up?
Well, there is no brownfield tax credit anymore.
Oh, no.
No, that went away a few years ago. But when I get into grants, we'll talk about what happened to kind of cover that.
You're thinking of the brownfield TIF.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
so there's
quite possible.
program.
Yeah, so there still is the TIF money, but there is not. We used to have a great tax credit for brownfields, and we
good
don't
times,
anymore.
guys.
It was amazing.
Oh, well, I guess we cleaned everything up.
Because that would cover things like just buying new furniture and stuff. If you were putting it into a brownfield site, you could get the credit on the furniture and fixtures and everything too.
Well, and we should probably make a distinction between financing and grants.
Yes, so that's why I'm looking right now at, we're just talking about the tax abatements. So we got the Oprah, that's the holy grail. There's also the payment in lieu of tax, which until January of this year only applied to projects that were going to get were either owned, public housing owned by the government, or if they're owned by the government, pay the pilot. But if they were getting low-income housing tax credits, in which case, if you were a limited dividend housing association,
Which is LIHTC.
you could do a payment in lieu of tax, and you would make an agreement with the municipality that you would pay, let's say, a 10% fee rather than in lieu of what would normally be the full tax obligation. Because if you have a $20 million building that, if you were using as its highest and best use, would be taxed at X thousands of dollars, but you're renting to people who are Section 8 housing recipients, you're not making enough money to cover that tax liability. So the pilot was there. So in January, Governor Whitmer signed a package of 4 different bills, and one of those bills, they were all trying to address the housing crisis, because everyone understands that there is a housing crisis.
Yes.
And one of those allows municipalities to enter into pilots, even if you're not getting low-income housing tax credits. But because it was just passed, nobody really knows exactly what the requirements of that program are going to be. So we're keeping a lookout, but right now we don't know what exactly that's going to look like and what the requirements are going to be. Ideally, what it would be is something like, okay, well, you can agree for a portion of the project or a portion of the taxes, and give you some flexibility in terms of how much would be deeply affordable versus fully affordable versus market rate, and kind of give you an adjustment so that it was more flexible than just pay X or don't. But we don't know. We don't know what that's going to look like. So those are all the tax abatements. And then we have alternative financing sources. So we were talking about tax increment financing just a minute ago, and people out there may be going, what? Tax increment finance is a mechanism that either brownfield redevelopment authorities or downtown development authorities can use. And so your project either has to be in a DDA or be a brownfield. And what will happen is, for example, a brownfield redevelopment authority will come in and say, okay, you have gap financing, more than what PACE is going to cover. We will cover it, but it can only be for eligible activities under those statutes, right? So, for example, eligible activities in a brownfield redevelopment authority may be cleaning up the brownfield situation. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily going to cover vertical construction. Mm-hmm. But what the brownfield authority will then do is say, okay, let's say you have $2 million, because apparently I like $2 million. You have $2 million of eligible expenses. We will finance that, or whatever you can get financed over a period of 25 years or whatever the statute maxes you out at. And what we'll do is we'll say, okay, your tax revenue right now is here. So if your tax revenue is zero, this is not realistic, but if your tax revenue right now is zero for the municipality, and you put a $20 million building on it, which would then be, the assessed value would be $10 million, and then you multiply that by whatever the mills are, that incremental increase then will go back to the developer to pay for those eligible expenses. So it's a way to finance those expenses. The problem is the developer needs the cash today, not 25 years from now. Mm-hmm. So the brownfield redevelopment authorities, or in a couple of cases I've had CDFIs be willing to provide bridge.
What's a CDFI?
It's a community development finance institution. So they're authorized by Treasury, so they're usually a nonprofit, and they provide more flexible financing, sometimes as expensive, sometimes less expensive. They're mission-driven. Sometimes more expensive than regular capital.
Mm-hmm. So like Invest Detroit.
Invest Detroit, LISC, IFF.
CIP, Capital Impact Partners.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So, and they each, you got to kind of Google CDFIs and see CNAIR, because they all have a different mission. IFF, I know, likes daycare centers, right? Because they want to
community centers.
Schools.
Yeah, so they want to make sure that they're incentivizing things that will benefit low-income communities generally. Mm-hmm. So, in the so those CDFIs I've had provide bridge loans for the tax increment finance, so they'll pay you today, and then they get the revenue for the next 25 years to pay back that loan.
And it can end up being quite sizable too.
Yes.
I've seen deals where they, over 23, 24 years, they've gotten $1 million back. Mm-hmm. And that environmental, and what they're paying for is the contamination in the ground, but what people don't often know. So I want you brokers out there to tell your clients that a brownfield TIF will also pay to remove any debris in the ground. As all of you probably know, Detroit did a lot of, demolition. And guess what? I think up until maybe the 80s, they just dumped it into the basement.
Well, as a broker, I can attest to the fact that we haven't touched a property in Detroit that didn't have contamination. Mm-hmm. It's 100% guaranteed something is in
So
the
for the
soil.
arena, for example, we're close to Little Caesars Arena right now, right? Little Caesars Arena, I believe there was dirt that needed to be removed, so they had to bring in trucks to pull out some dirt that was potentially contaminated and have that disposed of properly, whatever that means to the environmental people. And then, if new dirt, they may have had to bring new dirt in. They may have they were going to dig a hole anyway. I don't know, but they did have some stuff that needed to be removed. Yeah. As Sonya's saying, I had a project where, we're looking at a vacant land site and it looks like it's fine, nothing questionable about it. But as soon as any research was done on what had happened to it, we had phase one. It was like, there was a building there and it was demolished, and essentially it was demolished into a hole and then there was sand put over it. So what is now you have to worry about geotechnical and stuff, because are you going to have to put in steel risers in there so that you don't have any, issues with the ground being moved around because it's just a bunch of bricks? And
circling back to the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation and integrating it with some of the strategic neighborhood corridors, what are the benefits of these strategic neighborhoods, and what is it the DEGC is going to provide?
Mhm. Well, we were offline having pretty good banter on this subject matter. Now, the strategic neighborhoods are those that have been identified by the city, first and foremost. Why those neighborhoods? Because their neighborhoods have stabilized neighborhoods around them already. So it only makes sense, right, to target those neighborhoods that are not on the cliff,
On the fringes.
on the cusp, on the
yeah.
fringes of becoming disenfranchised.
And they have broadened them. They recently went from having 7 to 10 now.
Yeah, that's great.
Which is a big leap.
Mhm. So the other thing that I like to tell people, developers, follow the money.
Absolutely.
Follow the money. So direct your clients to, if they want to work in these neighborhoods, direct them to the strategic neighborhoods that are already identified by the city, because that's where funders want to fund. So that's the first thing. The other thing that we talked about was, again, Detroit Economic Growth Corporation and its resources.
Mm-hmm.
So guys, when you're talking to your client, wouldn't it be great if you already knew there was a tax abatement district already established by some other developer?
On a property that maybe you have listed for sale so that you can help
Market
incentivize people
Right.
to buy it?
Mhm.
Yeah, so if your client already owns the property, they own the property, right? But if your client is looking for something and they just have an idea, I want to open a doggy daycare, I want to open
Where
a
should I
bonbon
open
company.
it? Easy.
Well, Jefferson Chalmers is a strategic neighborhood, whereas so we were talking about Dexter Linwood. I don't know if that is or not. I don't think it is yet. I think it will be soon. It's up and coming.
Mhm.
But right now, it's not where everyone is focusing their energy and their loan dollars and things like that. So, for example, Invest Detroit specifically looks at strategic neighborhoods that the city has identified in their strategic neighborhood initiative and says, okay, we're going to prioritize making loans to those neighborhoods.
So their money will have greater impact. So
Exactly.
It's very thoughtful. But I think if you go to the DEGC website, especially like Ellen said, if you already know the address, then just look on their mapping system. It's color coded. It tells you what abatements are there already. NEZ, Oprah, what's going on, and we didn't touch on OZ,
I have that on my
Opportunity Zone.
We won't
so
forget.
Lisa's going to tell you all about that.
We won't forget opportunity zones, but yes, so the DEGC map does show opportunity zones.
I believe
as
it
well.
does.
That would make sense.
CoStar, if you're in
Yeah.
CoStar, which most of us are for commercial brokers,
Well,
And
It
new
identifies.
market tax credits also, maybe not DEGC, but Novogradac.
I was just going to say
Which-
my favorite website is Novogradac,
Right.
which Novogradac is an accounting firm, and they do financial projections for low-income housing tax credit deals, new markets tax credits, that kind of thing. So they have an excellent
Great.
mapping tool. I always go there first to figure out whether something is in a severely distressed zone. But then I have to go to the city or to the state for opportunity zones. I believe Novogradac does actually now identify opportunity zones as well, but when they first came out, you had to go to the state for the state map. But we'll circle back to opportunity zones because I have that. It's kind of a separate federal programs list, but I want to talk first about the state grants that are out there. So
and grants are free money.
free money, not
Free money.
mostly free money.
You don't have to repay it.
You do have to pay taxes on it though when it's so you have to pay grants on forgiven debt, and you have to pay your federal income tax on forgiven debt or grants that you get in the door. So they're not completely free because Uncle
Taxes.
Sam wants his money, but they're free in that you don't have to pay a lender back.
Right.
Now, some of these grants, however, are going to come with strings attached in terms of there will be a clawback if you don't meet the requirements that you have agreed to, your client has agreed to. So way back in the day in Michigan, we used to have a bunch of tax credits before Governor Snyder. We had a brownfield tax credit, which we talked earlier about was amazing. We also had a historic tax credit. Those all went away. Now, historic is back, but they all went away at one point when Snyder was Snyder was governor. And instead, there were 2 grant programs, because his goal of being an accountant and, you know, the nerd, whatever, was to simplify programs, because the tax credit programs were very complicated, and the compliance was it was tough for companies who were just like, I just want the money, right? So the grant programs were meant to make it a little bit easier and more streamlined. And that's all fine, but they did not have as much money attached to them as the tax credit programs did, so they did a little bit less. They hit the budget less, but they also did a little bit less in terms of benefit to the developer or company coming in to create jobs or whatever the case may be. So, we also had a tax credit called the MEGA, which was that was a tax credit based on jobs. So if you were a new manufacturer of hybrid vehicles who were like, I don't know if I want to go to Tennessee or Michigan, and Michigan put together a package and say, we'll give you some of your employees' withholding tax back for the number of employees who you bring as new jobs to the state, that was the mega tax credit. So instead of the mega tax credit, there was a grant program called the Michigan Business Development Program that is still there. So if you have a client who's going to create a lot of jobs, you want to look at that program, because that can be a lot of money.
Actually, I've seen as low as 10 jobs.
Yeah, it's 10 jobs is the max, the minimum. And I believe it might be even less if they're technical jobs. It could be 5 jobs, but you'd have to look at the statute. I haven't looked at the statute in a while.
And who administrates that?
The Michigan Economic Development Corporation. Okay. So that's a direct grant between you and the state of Michigan.
And those representatives love to talk about, new business opportunities, new development. So don't shy away. Just feel free to tell your clients again, go to the MEDC website, and I'm sure there'll be a list somewhere, drop-down box that says who to contact based upon geography.
Yep, because there are like 8 different regions in the state. And I will say it's all about telling the story, right?
Yes.
You're going to tell the story of why you need this incentives and why it's going to make the state even better. So the Michigan Business Development Program, or the Business Development Program, is the grant program for job creation. Then there's CRP, Community Revitalization Program. That one was meant to take care of replace the historic tax credit and the brownfield tax credit. So the community revitalization program is grant dollars not based on jobs, though if you're going to create jobs, you certainly want to tell that story, but it's for like infill, brownfield sites, things like that. So if you have a project in downtown Howell and it's a vacant building that has just been sitting there vacant for 10 years and you're going to rehab it, then that's a good infill project where you can say, hey, I need $100,000. This is my gap. Can you provide that? So again, it's all about telling the story so that you can justify getting whatever you're asking for, right? So that also is an MEDC program. So both of those grant programs are directly with the MEDC.
And can I say, I don't
Yeah.
want to, okay,
Go
great. I just want to mention that PACE Equity has worked alongside the MEDC Community Revitalization Program dollars. Most times that money comes in the form of debt. They do have grants, or they can do it in the form of a grant up to a certain dollar amount, and I think that changes by budget year, but you definitely don't want to sleep on that. But my point is, depending upon the size of your deal or your client's deal, you may need all of these, because everyone has a budget. You can go to a CDFI, but they all have lending limits. There's only, so much they can do. PACE Equity, we have limits too, but we do loans as little, or what we call special assessments, really. Special assessments is little right now as $800,000 and as much as you need. Over $100 million if you need it for your project. So my point here is that all of these programs can work in conjunction together. Even if you have new markets, even if you have low-income housing tax credits, it gets a little crazy there with bifurcation of the land and legal descriptions, but it can be done. And PACE Equity, CDFI funds, state funds, federal funds can all play in the sandbox together for the most part.
And I would say, so when I talked at the beginning that I deal with complex capital stacks, when we talk about a complex capital stack, the stack is you have 7 different things, right? I recall that when the book Cadillac was being done, somebody said that there were 10 layers of the capital stack. So, or 20. It was something insane, like 20 layers of the capital stack, right? So that meant there was a primary lender, maybe there was PACE, that's 2 layers. There was a grant, that's the 3rd layer. So all of those layers together, my job is to make sure all of those deal documents work together and everybody understands why somebody has to subordinate to someone else and all of that, right? You'll have intercreditor agreements in some cases if you've got multiple actual, like, true lenders. Sonya, what you said, though, made me also think of something. There is a state cap on the grant programs, like I believe CRP might be $1 million or $1.5 million of grant dollars they can give out, but they can also do a loan. So you could get a $10 million CRP loan that you have to pay back, but with friendly terms, and $1.5 million grant. That grant might be structured, and it's probably going to be structured as a forgivable loan so that they have those clawbacks in. So that, you know, for 5 years you're going to create 200 jobs. And if you don't keep those 200 jobs for that 5 years, you're going to pay back a portion of the forgivable loan, or else it'll be forgiven, and then truly it was a grant, but it was a grant with clawbacks in it. But yeah, so sometimes it's structured in a way that here's the statutory cap on what we can provide as a true grant, but we can also give you a loan.
Yes, yep. So both of those options are available to your clients as resources to build their capital stack. So again, this is all about helping you to help your client and to get the deal done.
Especially in this climate.
Yeah.
Especially in this climate.
That's a good segue for the next 2 programs that I want to talk about that are state grant programs. And these are new-ish. One is the missing middle program, and the other is revitalization and placemaking, RAP. So missing middle did have about $15 million round 1 back in March of 2022, but there was just another $50 million in the budget that was passed by the governor a couple weeks ago that went into the missing middle program. Round 2, the applications will be out March 20th-ish. And there's going to be $80 million that there are specific allocations for various regions. So like the Upper Peninsula is one region that has X dollars that will be associated with it, so that we know that things are going to go all over the state and money isn't just going to go to one location, right? But the missing middle program is specifically for housing that will address whatever the missing middle is. And I'm saying that because it just says as defined by the state. But typically missing middle is that it's not low income housing. We have programs for that, and we'll talk about the federal program in a minute. But there's no program for housing for people who are above 120% of the AMI to 300% of the AMI. And again, that might not be what the state defines it as, but it's basically when you think of people who are lower income professionals, like firefighters, police officers, teachers,
housing,
who aren't they can't afford luxury homes, which is basically kind of like what everything is now if it's not low income.
Let me quantify what Lisa's talking about, and forgive me, I may be a year dated. I might be thinking 2022. Well, we'll go with 2022. So, a family of 4 in the city of Detroit, the median income, or 80% of the median income, was roughly, let's call it $60,000. That's mom and dad making $30,000 each. So whatever role that is, what's $15 an hour? Times somebody did the math.
Times 2080. No, I can do it. 28. So 2,080 hours is the average. That's the 40 hours a week. So 2,080 times 15. That's $31,000 a year.
There you go.
Right there.
So mom and dad, or mom and grandma, or mom and her adult son, whatever the makeup of the family. That's pretty much $15 an hour is the median for the city of Detroit if they have a full-time job at that level. So that kind of frames, so when you're talking about the missing middle, the people actually there, they're not going to be able to get on Section 8. They're not going to be able to get public housing. They could probably get into low-income housing tax credits, but that's probably going to be a hard fit. So there's no funding for housing for this population.
And paying $2,000 a month rent because they
Is
can't
most
afford
of
a
their
mortgage
income.
is beyond. So I'm looking at, so the other program
But we do
requirement.
digress.
No. No, it's not really though, because the missing middle program also says that the intent of it is that because it can go to either apartments, for rent housing, or for a developer doing for sale housing, but the intent is that whoever the missing middle recipient is, the end user, will spend no more than 30% of their income, which is the typical,
Which is standard.
on their housing. But people in that group that you mentioned are spending much more. And then how do they afford anything else, like food, right? So for that $60,000 a year family, that would be $18,000 a year in rent or mortgage payments. So the statute does specifically say that end user, 30% or less of their annual income should be going toward payment for living, housing. So the missing middle program, that application is not ready, but you can go to the MEDC, or no, sorry, that's not MEDC, that's MSHDA. So there are two different places to go for finding money, and if it's housing, it's probably on MSHDA's website, mshda.gov, Michigan State Housing Development Authority. And then the other programs that I talked about, the CRP, the BDP, and the one I'm going to talk about, the RAP, those are all through MEDC. So the RAP, the revitalization and placemaking, that's available for public infrastructure, for a variety of things, including development. But that application is also, it's kind of been redone because the original money coming for the RAP program was ARP money, and the new money is not ARP money, it's state budget money. So they're going to change some of the requirements, because if you get federal money, you're stuck with federal requirements such as Davis-Bacon, which is prevailing wage, which then increases your costs because you got to pay prevailing
Which
wage.
are already high.
Right. So now maybe in Detroit, prevailing wage equals what contractors are getting paid anyway. But when you're talking about prevailing wage in northern Michigan, now you got to pay prevailing wage, which is probably much higher than what the general contractors are getting paid normally for a project in a rural area. So you gotta comply with all of the federal requirements. So the RAP application is being reformatted right now. It's not available right now because they are going to be changing some of those requirements. Missing middle, you do have to comply with Davis-Bacon, but you don't with the prevailing wage requirements, but not any of the other requirements, like the reporting requirements and stuff. So the RAP program has $100 million. So there's $80 million in missing middle, $100 million in the RAP program. And one of them, I believe it's missing middle, will be accepting applications from March to September of this year. So if you're looking at a missing middle type project, stay on top of MSHDA's website.
Follow the
because
legislation.
they will
Or
review.
call Lisa.
Yeah, they will
Yeah,
review
call
those applications as they come in. So as soon as that application comes in, you're going to want your client to fill it out and apply. So I think that covers everything statewide. So if you guys don't mind, we can talk about federal.
Yes.
So,
let's move to
so the federal incentives, this is kind of where I had my start. The federal incentives they're a lawyer and accountant job retention program. So in Michigan, it used to be when we had the tax credits, you could sell those, right? You could just transfer them to someone else. Okay, well, I don't have a need for tax credits as a developer because I don't have any income this year because I just had a bunch of expenses. But I can sell this tax credit to a bank or somebody that has tax liability in the state. Not so in the federal world. You can't just go sell your tax credits. So there's this convoluted system where you have to structure the deal so that the project exists for whatever the compliance period is. For historic tax credits, that's 5 years. For new markets tax credits, that's 7 years. For low-income housing tax credits, it's 10 years. There's another 5 years in addition to that, but the 10 years is the tax credit period. So let's talk about those 3 programs that I just mentioned. Historic tax credits are for rehabilitation of historic buildings. So your friend in this scenario is going to be SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, because you have to submit a Part 1, which describes the project, and a Part 2 says what you're going to do to the project. SHPO then says, okay, we're going to talk to the feds for you and we're going to approve this for tax credits. If it's approved for tax credits, you do all of the improvements without messing with the historic nature of the building.
So what is historic?
There's a criteria for how old it is, and I don't know what year that is.
And
it
it
has
1936, but it seems
it
like
may
it's
have gone-
changed a little bit.
Yeah.
And also, and let me preface my statements too. You really have a great team here you put together, Ellen. For the historic tax credits, again, with my banking hat on, I actually invested in historic tax credits for the bank as an investor.
Okay.
And I actually was a funder doing the bridge loans that you mentioned before for historic tax credits. And so anyway, what you're saying, and then you have the lawyer, like Lisa just said, your historic tax credit deal, we always said it had to be at least $5 million to cover your legal and accounting fees.
Yeah. Truth. No.
It's true.
I would say even 5 million is low, but yeah. So
at minimum of 5
yeah, for
million.
because for new markets, I always say 10 to 20 million.
Yeah, yeah.
Because no matter how small the project is, it's going to be the same legal and accounting costs.
Exactly.
I still have to review all of the same documents. The accountant still has to prepare financial projections for the investor. And so that doesn't change because it's a small deal.
But if you are telling your clients, when you look at the DEGC website, if you see if it's a historic district, and hopefully it's on there, hopefully I'm not steering you guys in the wrong direction with that. But if it is, I love historic tax credits because it's not a hard program to understand.
Yeah, it's pretty easy.
It is free money outside of legal and CPA fees.
Right. Yeah. Well, so and here's the thing. So it is free money. That it has some cost to it, but it's essentially all of these programs essentially are an equity injection, right? So
exactly.
So with the historic tax credits, I'm selling it to when Sonya's at the bank, her banking hat. Banks are huge investors in all of these federal tax credits because they're federal tax credits, and the banks always have federal tax liability.
Exactly. So explain that a little bit.
Yeah, go into that a little further.
Yeah. So what happens is, okay, you're a developer. You are developing a property. You're entitled to tax credits on that property. You don't need them because you don't have any federal tax obligations because you
have depreciation.
You've put a bunch of money out. You're
tax
depreciating. You've got all
shelters.
these benefits, and you don't have like millions of dollars that you need to offset. JP Morgan Chase does, and they are a huge tax credit investor. They're not the only one. Most of the big banks have a community development arm that is involved in all of these tax credits and either purchasing them or being involved in some other way. And I'll get into that with the new markets part of it. But historics are kind of the easiest of the 3 of these. So it's a good segue into wading in because you do your part 1 and your part 2 as long as you do all of the improvements and don't mess with the historic facade and all of that, which usually the big issue is windows.
Always.
Because you can't put new double pane windows in because that changes the historic nature of the building.
It can't be aluminum or whatever.
Right. So, but then
They will be expensive.
you file a part 3 at the end. So you're getting financed before you file the part 3. But one of the contingencies is going to be you file that part 3 with it's actually the National Parks Office, which always seems kind of weird because
Department of Interior.
Yeah, it's
National Parks.
it's parks, but we're talking about buildings. So, so SHPO and the National Park Service kind of control this program. But you get your tax credit, and Sonya, when she's at the bank, buys your tax credit. That goes into at the closing. That's money into the project, and then they let's say what they're doing is purchasing the tax credit. So they come in as an investor because we can't just sell the tax credits.
You have to be an owner in the property.
You have to be an owner in the project. So they come in as an investor in the project, and they sit there for the 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, 5 years and a day, we're going to unwind this whole thing because now it's all done. We're out. No, they don't want to be involved in the project. They just have to be in order to get the tax credits. So typically what happens in each of these programs is there's a pricing. And I don't recall, like I haven't done a historic in a few years, so I don't know what the current pricing is, but it could be anywhere between 70 and 90 cents on the dollar, right? So the bank will say, okay, I have a lot of tax liability. I'll pay you 90 cents for your dollar of tax credits. So they pay for the tax credits, you take a little bit of a cut, you get money into the project, we all sit there for 5 years, 5 years and a day, we unwind and we all go our separate ways.
But you're not losing any money.
No.
It's not like you're losing any money in the cut. So, some historic preservation expert is going to go through your construction budget, pick out what's eligible. Typically, acquisition can't be a part of it. It's going to pick out what's eligible and come up with this big number. And then you're going to do essentially, because it has to be an investment, typically it's 99% to the investor, I think 1%.
Yep.
But anyway, I digress with that. The point is that big number is then multiplied by 90 cents, and that's the money that comes into your project as equity. That otherwise would not be at the table.
Wow.
Yep, and that would be on your closing statement. That's your 1.9 million that is coming in that you're getting paid essentially for free for.
Free.
So that's the historic one. That's kind of the easiest one to understand. And then we have new markets tax credits. New markets is a little bit more convoluted, but kind of the same concept. Pricing depends on a variety of factors. Again, if we're in a recession and the banks aren't going to have as much tax liability, then the pricing is going to be lower because there's less competition. If banks are flush with cash and they want to offset their tax liability, and they also, this is a double dip for the bank, they also get Community Reinvestment Act. They have obligations under the Community Reinvestment Act, and participating in these programs gives them credit for that. So because the new markets project has to be in a qualified census tract, which is a severely distressed census tract. So
historics are not limited by geography.
Yeah, historic can be anywhere. But for the CRA credit, so the CRA was created because of redlining in the past, and this is black neighborhood.
You guys learned all of that in realtor.
Did they give that in realtor class?
Yeah.
Okay, so the redlining, this is trying to address that by saying, okay, well, you're going to go into the city of Detroit and you're going to take money from that population. You need to reinvest in that population as well. So a bank will get their credit under the CRA for participating in a new markets deal, and they get tax credits by buying the tax credits.
And what I think is important here too is for the brokers to know a new markets deal, it is geography, and typically it's for manufacturing or business concern. However, you can do new markets in a mixed use building. So you can have residential and commercial, but there's limitations on how much you make from each pot.
So there are some regulations. First of all, they can't be a sin business. So you can't do a tanning salon, which isn't a sin, but we call it sin business. Not packaged.
No, the strip.
no strip clubs. No tanning salons, and
no liquor stores.
No packaged liquor for takeout. You can, however,
Serve.
You can new markets finance a brewery.
Okay.
As long as their packaged liquor for resale is a very small amount.
There
But
are-
you can't do it. The point is that they don't want to finance a bunch of liquor stores on every corner. We already got those. So we don't need any more
Those are
of those.
closing.
Right. But if you are Bell's Brewery and you wanted to do a project, you could.
Oh, we just
Do
opened,
New Markets
our
finance
office
that.
just leased a property for a new distillery in Ferndale.
Yeah. So you could, if it was in a qualified census tract, and again, if it was a $10 to $20 million deal, because it doesn't make sense below that, you could qualify for new markets tax credits for that. But one of the exclusions, which is what Sonya is referencing, is that new markets cannot be used, sort of, for residential rental housing. Except Except you can use it for residential rental if the residential income is 20% or less of the total income of the project. So if you're doing a mixed use, I believe, I was not involved in this, but I believe 1212 Griswold in Capitol Park, Richard Harp's and Hosey's project, I believe that got New Markets tax credits. So here's how that was structured.
Yeah.
3 floors were rented as office space to the Archdiocese, the Catholic Archdiocese. Another 3 floors are residential housing, and then the bottom floor is retail, the club or restaurant or something. The revenue from that is such that those 3 floors of residential are less than 20%, so they would qualify for New Markets financing.
Wow.
Creative capital stack.
Exactly. So while we say it can't be used for residential for rent, that doesn't mean it can't really be used for residential for rent. Now, I will also say that you can use it for sale housing. So that gets a little creative because you got to keep the project around for 7 years because that's the compliance period for tax credits for under the IRS rules. But if you're selling houses as part of that, you keep the entity that is selling the houses there for 7 years. That should work. So you just kind of gotta
So what about
work
a
with the
condo
rules.
development? How do you...
Well, condo development again depends on if it's just residential, then it won't qualify. But if it's mixed use condo,
Think about the Book Cadillac.
Yeah.
Or all of these properties that have hotels and apartments that some of them went condo.
Right, right.
Later, after the 7 years burnt off.
with historics, like I bought a condo in New Center back in the day, and that was you had to rent for the first 5 years, and then at the end of the historic tax credit period, they would sell you the condo. Because they had to own the property for the 5 years. Now, the other thing that people will do is condo something out and then just exclude the residential. So if they don't need the money to cover the costs, because you would have to take out the costs, from your pro forma for that residential part of it. So let's say that was $2 million out of your $12 million. You'd only have $10 million that you could use for the New Markets to calculate your New Markets tax credit, but you could completely exclude that condo and then just only use the office condo and the retail condo for purposes of doing your calculation and for your project. Nonprofits also can use New Markets tax credits because again, you're selling off the tax credit. You don't care whether or not it's going to be used. So for example, you may be a nonprofit that is building a daycare facility and some other, community benefit or training center, job training center. Your client could be a nonprofit. They can still use the New Markets program because they're not the ones that are going to use the tax credit. They're going to sell that for equity.
Oh, wow.
So all of that's a great program for projects that are over $10 million in a qualified census tract and meet those kind of criteria that we talked about in terms of residential, not a liquor store, not a strip club, not a tanning salon, definitely not cannabis, because these are federal programs. So then we get to low income housing tax credit. So if you have a 100% income, residential project and it's going to be low income or a portion low income, it doesn't have to be 100% low income. You might have a project that is 50% market rate and 50% low income. But the problem is that, so there are two different, let me step back. The low income program, housing tax credit program, has 2 separate tranches to it. One is a 9% tax credit, so you get a 9% credit on all of your eligible expenses. The other one's a 4%. The 4% is automatic as long as you meet the criteria. You get that 4%. You don't have to compete with anybody. You just have to meet all of the eligibility criteria. The 9% is extremely competitive because that's the federal government gives each state housing authority a certain amount of allocation that they can allocate every year because they're losing it as federal revenue as a tax credit. So the 9% program is extremely competitive. So usually what you end up with is everybody who's competing and submitting applications going, we're going to make 100% of it low income and some of it's going to be for 40% AMI and some of it's going to be for 60% AMI. Because you get more points. It's like this whole scoring rubric based on, is it walkable? Is it on a bus line? Which makes it very difficult for rural projects to qualify at all because they don't have public transportation. So they try to adjust the rubric every couple of years in what's called a QAP. That QAP, every 2 years they get feedback and then they say, okay, we're going to adjust the criteria. But that criteria, I have a client who submitted and she gave me the books and it was 2 5-inch binders this thick. That was the application.
Oh.
We got denied. We did not get the application.
They didn't want to read it.
No, every single one of them is that big. It's a massive amount of information that you have to compile. Now, if you qualify for it, it's a significant injection into your capital stack. And if you are going to rent to that population, you can't rely on I can't charge $3,000 a month rent. I'm not building luxury apartments, so you need that tax credit.
So I can give you some color on that. I haven't, again, banker hat. I use same thing. Bought credits as well for the bank as well as provided debt to LIHTC deals. And the LIHTC in a 9% deal, you have to go out and get bank finance. You don't have to. I think it's changed a little bit. But again, the 9% credit, you come to the bank and say, hey, I need a construction loan. Typically, that was 40% of the project cost, only 40%. The tax credits covered roughly 60% of the project cost.
That
so
is big.
The other big driver for real estate investors to do LIHTC is one of the only programs where developers' fee has to get paid.
Well,
now, however, if you agree to defer a portion of that development fee, you get more points.
Which is always.
Oh my! So now you got to decide what you
and
look
I
for.
think, do you know offhand what is it? Is it $2.5 million max?
The developer fee, it's something like that.
Yeah.
So no matter how much brain damage, and these are a lot of brain damage. This is not an easy deal, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a developer who's building luxury condos, you can just be like, I'm going to go out and finance it. I'm going to get some investors. Boom, I'm done. And you could have a 30% developer fee if your lender's going to be okay with that. But you get all of the revenue, whether it's through a developer fee or just cash flow on the project.
Which is just to let you know, with my banker's hat on, we don't pay developer fees.
Right.
But you get paid out of cash flow.
Yeah, you get the cash
That's
flow.
the whole point.
But here's the thing with the LIHTC, they don't cash flow.
They don't cash flow.
They don't cash flow. Because the whole point of it is, like, when you look at that bottom line, maybe you have enough money to pay a developer fee, which is when then we start getting into the Novogradics and the Kohn-Resnicks of the world going, you can't defer that much because we don't have enough to pay you, and that is an obligation that needs to be paid. So you can't defer 40% of your developer fee, right? But after you pay the developer fee and you have your reserves, because they're going to require that you have a replacement reserve, because what's the biggest issue with low-income housing? Nobody ever fixes anything, so it starts to fall apart. So you're going to have deferred maintenance reserve, replacement reserves, interest reserves, tax reserves, all of these reserves, and you're not going to have any money. It's not like you're going to have investors other than the tax credit investor who are going to be like, sweet, I'm going to get 12% return per year on this. That's not going to happen in a low-income housing tax credit deal. And that's why the pilot, right? That's because you can't even pay, it's not going to cash flow to pay what the normal property tax would be. I think in Detroit it's 85 mils. 85 mils on a $20 million project.
It's a lot of money.
You don't have the cash revenue when you're renting to somebody at 40% AMI.
No.
So these are very difficult deals. Even with the tax credit, there are a lot of brain damage, and they don't cash flow. So the only thing that the developer is going to get is that developer fee. They're not going to get. But hey,
if you're doing a LIHTC deal every 2 years. $1.5 million payday, whatever it is.
Right, but you are going to get your developer fee rather than just you're just the developer, and what you're going to get on a luxury to Sonya's point is the cash flow on the back end, which could be buku bucks, but that's all up to you and how you're running your operations.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how I always understood LIHTC, is that the benefit was in front.
Yeah, it's all in the developer fee and getting all of that done at the front.
But there are not many being done now.
Well, the problem is that it's so competitive. I mean, if you look, you can go to MSHDA's website and see who won each year. like what, you know,
They put out
because it's publicly available. They'll put out the list, and one of the things that they will do is if you score a certain amount, they'll say if you want, you can meet with us and we can give you feedback. But I've had clients who have put in the same project 3 or 4 years in a row, or well, it's usually twice a year. The applications are accepted, so 3 or 4 times in a row. Because sometimes it's just a matter of we don't have enough allocation. It's not that you don't have a great project,
Right.
but I can't get the project done if I can't get the tax credits, and there just isn't enough of the tax credits to go around.
And Ellen, too, sometimes they used to do a set aside for Detroit. Sometimes they're just not they feel like they have done enough.
Yeah, and we're like, now we need to do outstate stuff.
We have to do outstate, so that might be what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yes.
because like now a lot of it was in the last few years was like, okay, well Detroit's getting everything. What about Traverse City? What about Marquette? What about Sheboygan? What about Grand Rapids? And I think in the last round, if I recall what I looked at, there were several kind of Grand Rapids Kalamazoo awards. So in the last round, it was a lot of kind of outstate. There were a few Detroit projects.
Well, I think, we have to always be cognizant that the state is a little bigger than this one city,
and
right?
and nobody has affordable housing. It's not just a Detroit issue.
It's a demand. I mean, there's a lack of affordable housing across this country, so.
So we're going to start winding down. This has been.
Well, I want to talk about one more.
Oh, you have another credit?
Well, no, I want to talk about opportunity zones for a hot sec.
Oh, geez, yes.
And then we can also talk about what you and I were talking about in terms of the conversions and stuff, but talking about the housing. But we were talking about opportunity zones, and that was a few years ago that program was created, and it had a couple of great tax benefits. The best one being that if you invest in an opportunity zone and you hold for a 10-year holding period, you never pay income tax on any of the income generated in that.
It's a deferment of the capital gain.
Yeah. Capital gains, yeah.
So, and then there was a step up in basis, but that doesn't really apply now because it's timing. Unless Congress changes the program, which there's been talk about doing. There's always also, by the way, new markets is not a permanent program. It expires every few years. So there's always talk about it becoming a permanent program.
Well, these are partisan programs.
Yeah.
So every time they do the budget,
somebody wants to hack it.
They're negotiating.
Now it always gets extended. I mean, this was a program
does.
New Markets was a bipartisan program. It was actually Jack Kemp, who I believe was a Republican. It was before my time. Was one of the sponsors, and I don't remember who the Democrat was, but back in the 80s, late 80s?
No.
90s.
New
It was the 90s.
Markets came in around the early 2000s. Because the bank asked me to figure it out.
Oh,
and you're asking the wrong person. I'll do my best.
Exactly who they were asking.
So late 90s, early 2000s was when it got, and usually what happens is something get passed and then it takes a couple years for anybody to figure it out, because again, the IRS has to make regulations and it takes them a while to figure it out.
Right.
So it's early 2000s, so it's a 20 plus year program. It's a pretty young program in terms of programs, but it is not permanent. So there again, this year, someone, made hey, let's make this permanent, and it probably won't be made permanent, but will probably get extended. And here's the reason why: because Congress likes to mess with budget by looking at things and going, well, that's not a permanent program, so we don't have to allocate things, allocate stuff for it.
When they're
we can pull it out of the budget, and then we'll just put it back in the budget later when we extend it, right? So it's all budget games, really. But so the Opportunity Zone program, that was a few years ago, and maybe it will get extended. But the issue I have seen with Opportunity Zones, I have done a couple of Opportunity Zone programs, not in the state of Michigan, but the problem with them is everybody thought that they were going to be a panacea. Oh, this is great. I get all these tax benefits. I'm going to give an investor a 3% return because they're going to get the tax benefit, so they'll be fine with getting a 3% return. And I'm like, no. Look, I'm an investor. There's no way I'd take that deal because I can put my money in the stock market and make 8%. So you better be giving me 9+% return and a tax benefit for your risky program in a severely distressed census tract, because opportunity zones are a small portion of a state's severely distressed census tract. They had to be severely distressed to be designated an opportunity zone.
Except that I have looked, I'm obviously familiar with some of the opportunity zones, and some of them are ill-placed. They're not consistent with what you would think the program is
Well, no,
driving.
there's one in Manhattan, but that specific census tract in Manhattan qualified as a severely distressed census tract.
Right. So I have a
Yeah.
property on Mac, for instance, that's right next to Indian Village.
Mm-hmm.
That's an opportunity zone. You go across the street, which is East English, and it's not.
Well, because here's the problem: that across the street property may be a severely distressed census tract. Each state was only allowed to designate 25% of all of its severely distressed census tracts as an opportunity zone.
Okay.
So what they tried to do is say, kind of like the strategic neighborhood initiative. Okay, if I designate this, we were talking about the area along Mac driving toward Grosse Pointe where it was just like nothing but fields and like one liquor store and a house. If I designate that an opportunity zone, no investor is going to invest in that project because nobody's going to want to go there for anything. Nobody's going to want to live there. So what they tried to do is say, okay, City of Detroit said, there are a couple of zones along the riverfront. We'll designate those opportunity zones because somebody might actually invest in that.
They want to develop it.
And develop that. So they tried to strategically pick opportunity zones in areas that were likely to be of interest to an investor.
So if you have, I know some people that's all they develop is opportunity zone property. What if they've acquired all this property, haven't developed it? Can they
Then they just,
lose
there's no
their
benefit.
opportunity? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, unless the opportunity zone gets expanded, or I think it's 2026 is the sunset date, but I could be wrong about that.
Because it was a 10-year program and we're well into
it. We're like past the 7-year step up in
yeah.
basis, so you don't get the step up in basis anymore. You still get that benefit of the 10-year holding period, but yeah, if they don't develop it by the time the program sunsets, unless it gets extended, then yeah, they have a bunch of property that now. They're just going to have to figure out how to develop without the benefit.
Okay, so financial perspective, I did a project in downtown Detroit. They had an existing building and construction of a new building. This project utilized OZ. And let's call it, I think it was a $50 to $60 million project. So it had bank debt, it had investor PACE equity, CRP, and OZ. So again, don't sleep on OZ because if you're looking at a $50, $60 million deal and the banks that we haven't really touched on.
Right, we were going
but
to.
the climate for getting traditional bank debt is a bit challenging. It's tough.
Very tough.
So they may be involved, and again, maybe the advance ratio won't be as aggressive, and you've got to fill that capital stack.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's not to say anything against the banks, but the interest rates are what they are. Construction costs are what they are, and your rental rates
because of
are what
COVID.
they are.
Yeah, and so
Well,
and to talk about the banks and the
and
financing from my perspective as a lawyer, like doing deals, I have just seen since October a kind of a complete freeze on traditional bank financing.
Yeah, well, there has been, and that's why this is an important discussion
So
right now.
it's not even that interest rates are high. I mean, they're much higher than they were. But once the Fed went, oh, we're going to increase it by 0.5%. Now we're going to increase it by 0.75%. Now we're going to increase it by another 0.5%. I think the banks are just kind of, and this is not to say anything bad about them. I totally understand why. They're just like, look, we're going to sit on the sidelines and
wait.
figure out what the hell is going on.
What's going on?
And once we figure out what's going on and when the Fed's going to just cool their jets, then maybe we're going to start. They're going to have to deploy capital again soon. Like banks that's what they're there for. So they can't just sit there forever not making loans. But I totally get why in the last 5 months they've just been like, unless it's like a super amazing project, we're just going to kind of wait.
Yeah.
So, which is exactly why we really need to look at, I think at all times we should be looking at all of these varieties of capital, but right now especially, developers are just, they have to try to figure out, like, pull all the couch cushions up and look for all the pennies.
It's funny because I have seen some developers that I represent sitting on projects waiting to try to get financing, try to make the stack work with all these credits. And as they're waiting, things are
just
getting
going
more
higher.
expensive.
Yeah.
So, and
Now-
it's not helpful that the rental rates are not really.
So this is a
Soaring.
good place for me to interject for my PACE equity hat that I actually wear now. Well, let me say this, construction financing typically is a floating rate.
Mhm.
That's part of the problem. You can't budget when
You have
the
no
rates,
idea.
the Fed keeps raising the rates.
Yep.
There's no way to really wrap your arms around it. So with PACE equity, however, consider the fact offsetting that risk, that interest rate exposure risk to your project by utilizing PACE equity, which does what? Fixes your rate
Mhm.
Okay.
at closing construction. So you're hedging your risk.
So
by
we
using
can
PACE
close on
equity.
PACE at construction financing, and then the lender can come in and do permanent. So here's
No,
like,
well, you still need a bank in it, so that still has to be figured out.
right.
However, by some of the monies that you're talking about here, especially the historic and even new markets, OZ, there's no interest rate attached to those
No.
programs unless there's a bridge loan.
Right.
And I can use it can be
Well,
put together
this
in
is-
certain ways.
This is probably a good time for us to stop because I know you guys could talk about this stuff forever, and it's been really fascinating, and I am so pleased that you guys came out. This one traveled far, and I know we all have busy lives, but this has been incredible.
Less
It
busy
has
than looking
been.
like a witness protection person because I have no power because of the ice storm. So just in case you guys are watching this 6 months from now, this was the day after the ice storm in Detroit.
Yes,
Um,
yes. Well,
so-
I also have the same problem,
But to close on that,
I-
Sonya, how do people contact you if they have PACE equity questions, not
Thank
problems?
you. Well, if you're seeking capital, and want to run your opportunity by me, I am very available to talk to you. My information will be posted
Be
at
tagged
the end of this video that you're watching. But again, I'm with PACE Equity. Is PACE, PACE-equity.com. You can go to our website and find all of our bio information and contact information, as well as at the end of this video.
yay.
I'm waiting to hear from you. Give me a call.
And I am Lisa Berden, Linchpin Legal. You can find me at linchpinlaw.com, LINCHPIN, like the piece that holds a wheel to an axle. And my phone number is 248-509-4498. Email lisa@linchpinlaw.com.
Thanks guys, and we will have that tagged so everybody will have your information available.